Cheers, Rockets fans. Welcome to The Locker Line, an exclusive podcast from the home of the Rockets.
Whoa!
Sports Talk 790.
Rockets!
The Locker Line is proudly served to you by Carbox Clutch City Lager.
It is good! Oh, yeah?
Red Nation, get ready. Get ready. The Locker Line starts now.
Welcome aboard.
Ben DuBose here, Paulo, Alves there. Thanks for checking out another new episode of The Lager Line, served to you by Clutch City Lager of Carbox Brewing. I'm Ben DuBose, your host. Paulo is our co-host and producer, and you can follow him on Twitter/X at Paulo Alves NBA. Me, I'm at Ben DuBose. Today, on this Thursday, May 23rd episode, we're joined by Bryan Kalbrosky, senior NBA staff writer at USA Today's For the Win. Bryan is, in my opinion, one of the best media guys out there when it comes to NBA draft coverage. So whenever the Rockets have a really good draft asset, which they certainly do this year at number 3 overall, we like to have him on to get his perspective on both what they should do as well as what they will do. Bryan, thanks so much for taking the time to join us. And as our longtime listeners may recall, a couple of years ago, we actually sniffed out the Paolo Banchero and Jabari Smith Jr. draft night flip-flop a few weeks in advance right here on this very podcast. So with that in mind, you ready to make some magic again?
Yeah, I definitely do remember that. And I appreciate you having me on. And I was really, listen, I think that it was one of those things where if every mock draft hadn't had it, I maybe would have been a little bit less confident in a way. I almost felt like it was like, listen, I didn't feel like it was the consensus that everyone projected that it was. And I'm very glad. I think I got part of the details wrong. I thought it was going to be actually Chet who went number 1. But either way, it was definitely one of those things that I'll remember for a while, because it just kind of goes to show that, you know, smoke screens can be very real sometimes. And I think that, you know, it's easy to fool even those who do the best of the mock drafts.
In the draft business, I think it also speaks to the power of consensus and, to an extent, groupthink this time of year, because it becomes so easy to fall into a trap when you see mock after mock in one direction to think that there's real momentum, when in reality, it's something that we have created as opposed to what's actually happening behind closed doors with the NBA teams making these decisions. And so I think that's a very useful case study to keep in the back of our minds as we go through the next few weeks looking at these mocks. Even if a lot of mocks are going a certain direction, that doesn't necessarily mean that's what the NBA teams are actually going to decide. Also, another fun fact for our listeners. So I was going back through my messages with Bryan from the pre-draft period a year ago, and I'm guessing you won't mind me sharing this because it's long after the fact, but even when all the hype surrounding the Rockets involved Amen Thompson, you actually told me in June that you were hearing some smoke about the Rockets and Cam Whitmore as well. Flash forward to the end of the month, and lo and behold, both Amen and Cam ended up being Rockets, and of course they both ended up having very encouraging rookie seasons. Now, it obviously took a little bit of luck to get to that outcome, with Cam staying on the board until Houston's second pick at 20. But as far as your intel, I do think it's pretty clear that there was something to it in terms of the Rockets being legitimately interested in Cam Whitmore. And I believe Rafael Stone, GM of the Rockets, actually came out in his post-draft press conference and basically confirmed the reporting that was out there that Houston was actually looking to trade up as early as late in the top 10 to get a pick for Cam Whitmore, couldn't agree on terms, and just got lucky that Cam somehow ended up staying on the board until 20. But the bottom line is there was something to the idea that the Rockets had interest not just in Amen Thompson, but Cam Whitmore as well. And I think that ultimately played out very well for them.
I think that that's absolutely right. And I think that, you know, that's cool that you were able to pull that out. And I think that, you know, had Amen maybe gone a little bit higher or a different situation had arisen, I think that Whitmore was probably one of the names they were considering at 4. And I think that realistically, you know, Amen was higher on their board. But a lot of teams, you know, create their own internal draft board and pull for the best available. And I think that once it got to pick 20, it became incredibly obvious that Whitmore was not going to fall to 21. I was in the building in Brooklyn, and I think I turned to somebody who I was sitting near, and I was just like, this is definitely where the slide stops. I also had written an article before the draft predicting that Whitmore was going to be the biggest slider in the draft, because while the Rockets were interested, it doesn't mean that every team's interested. And I think that there were a few teams that had concerns about him that I think at this point have probably been reported, and it doesn't necessarily mean that 20 was the right draft position for him. I think that there are probably teams who drafted players ahead of him that maybe already would redo that if they could, knowing what they know in hindsight. But I think that he was somebody who I had prepared a post for on draft night of why is Ken Whitmore falling into the draft, even before the draft had already started, just kind of preparing to post that on draft night. And obviously that is what ended up happening. But I think that it was a great match because, the Rockets were able to use him, and now they have such an abundance of talent on that roster, which leads us to where we are today, where, they were, just shy of the playoffs with, one of the deeper rosters in the NBA, as well as, a top 3 pick, which is crazy.
Absolutely. And to your point on 2023, to close the loop on that, yeah, if Portland had shocked the world and taken Amen Thompson at 3, and Paulo, you can cover your ears when I say what I'm about to say, I'm not 100% convinced that the Rockets would have taken Scoot Henderson at 4. I just don't think they valued him that highly through the pre-draft process. I think it's entirely possible that they could have gone Cam at 4 in that scenario.
Yeah, I think that that's actually real. And I think that Amen was probably the other player that Portland was looking at, which is not shocking considering 3 and 4 were, what they ended up as. But I think that Portland had serious consideration for Amen at 3. And I think that it was probably tough for them to decide between, him and Scoot. Paulo, are you still, I remember last year you were huge on Scoot after the freshman season he had. Are you still the same boat, or where are you at now?
Listen, man. Well, first of all, I think Ben's made his mission on this podcast to traumatize me. I mean, you mentioned the Paulo saga, which was very, very dear to me. You said
you were right on the Paulo evaluation, though.
We've been recording this podcast for over 2 years now. If that draft cycle, it's about that's a long time. I'm feeling old. And now you bring up the Scoot talk, which is even, it's not as bad as Paulo, but it's up there. I don't know if I'll survive this podcast to the end. But to answer Brian's question, I'm not as high as I was, obviously, because we have a season-long sample size, and I did think that Portland had a pretty good supporting cast of sorts or team structure for a point guard to slide into. They have pretty good vets. It's not a Rocket situation in the first 3 years where it was basically no good players around, the young players. But it's still a point guard. It's still an undersized point guard. He still has athletic tools. I still believe in the processing speed. I still believe that the jump shot's going to get there eventually. I'm not selling stock, especially because it's so undervalued right now until year 3. But I'm not unhappy whatsoever that we got Amen Thompson instead. I'll say that.
Yeah. And I do think that the reporting on draft day that there was some uncertainty with Portland is legitimate. To Brian's point, I do think that they at least gave that some very real consideration before ultimately going with Scoot. And perhaps in the ultimate way to troll Paulo, I'm sure you noticed the final weekend when Scoot went 6 for 6 on threes against the Rockets to start that game. Remember that? That was his weakness for most of the year. And yet that second to last game, somehow he went, made his first 6, including 1 from basically half court. Did that traumatize you in any way?
Listen, at that point, we already had, a big enough kind of sample size for me to be all in on what Amen Thompson can be. And we've talked about this on the pod. Even if he doesn't hit his ceiling, I still think that he, at the very least, will be an Aaron Gordon type of very, very valuable role player, which is not what I'm trying to sell people on. It's a time to be excited about the draft. But having a floor that high to me,
scenario.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think that's a good place to start because ultimately, no matter how you felt about the 2023 draft at the time, I think a year later, with the benefit of hindsight, we feel pretty good about the job that Rafael Stone and his front office in Houston did in evaluating talent. And hopefully that holds true through this 2024 cycle as well. Rockets picking at 3 in the first round. They also have a second rounder at, I believe, pick 44 from Golden State. Anyway, as far as this year's class, I want to start with the most basic fundamental question for you, Bryan. If you're sitting in the chair of Rafael or Ime Udoka, what's your macro perspective after having this pick basically fall into your lap? Keep in mind, it's supposed to be at 9 or 10, the pick from Brooklyn. They had just a 15% chance of being top 3, yet somehow it hit. And the reason I ask that, I've been all over the map. My first inclination on lottery day back on the 12th was to trade it, and certainly it's still possible. Because in the big picture, as you mentioned, Rockets already have a ton of young prospects. They were 41-41 last year. They want to take another jump next year, yet the Western Conference is really hard. So combine all those factors, and trading the pick for a veteran that helps you win now, it checks a lot of boxes. But when you look a little more in depth and you consider that both Tari Eason and Steven Adams are coming back from injuries, and with that, you already have a full 9-man rotation for next year. And so any veteran you bring in, you've got to ask the question, where are the minutes going to come from? Now, if the veteran is literally like an all-star level player, Kelly Iko reported Houston's interest in Donovan Mitchell earlier this week, then yeah, that's a different scenario. But I'm going to put that aside for now because there's just countless other considerations. If you're talking about literally trading for an all-star, because you'd be talking about assets going out way beyond just the number 3 pick. In terms of trading for a role player, which is easier and something I do think you could do just with the number 3 and salary filler. Rockets have a ton of expiring contracts they could use for matching. My thinking on that has really evolved over the last 10 days or so. Because not only do you have to consider the 9-man rotation the Rockets already have, the 5 starters for most of this year, Amen and Cam, and then Tari Eason and Steven Adams, but you've also got to consider the non-taxpayer mid-level, which will allow them to sign a guy at a starting salary of up to, I believe, $13 million. So if a guy you're hypothetically trading for isn't clearly better than someone you can just sign, and you've already got a rotation that's 9 or 10 deep, so it's not like you need that many bodies anyway, why wouldn't you just sign a veteran role player and keep the draft asset? In that same Kelly Iko article, he pointed out Malik Beasley as someone Houston would be interested in. He shot over 41% on threes with the Bucks, plays capable defense, just 27 years old. Bucks do not have bird rights on him. If the player you're hypothetically trading for isn't that much better than Malik Beasley, who would fit a role with the Rockets, why wouldn't you just sign Beasley with your MLE, your mid-level exception, which is higher since the Rockets are not a tax-paying team, and just draft 3 and have a prospect that you can develop for the future as well? Because the other factor to consider here is future contracts. Houston is a team that's about to get way more expensive. Assuming you keep this young core together, so Jalen Green and Alperen Sengun, they can get significant raises as soon as this offseason. They're extension eligible. They can get their second NBA contracts. And you've got to decide on that by the 2025 offseason at the latest. Jabari Smith, Tari Eason, they're just a year behind them. So you've got a team that's going to get way pricier, and you've got a new CBA that makes it tougher to maintain these expensive teams. With that in mind, as I see it, there's a lot of value in having a solid young role player on a cost-controlled rookie scale deal. And I know the downside of this class, as far as the 2024 crop of rookies, is that there's no Wemby, there's no Cade Cunningham, there's no Chet Holmgren, there's no can't-miss prospect at or near the very top. But if you feel good about the potential of at least getting a high-end role player, and I think it's fair to expect that from a number 3 overall in this class, to me, there's potentially a lot of benefit there for a team that's constructed like the Rockets and is about to get more expensive to just staying the course. Because even if there isn't super high-end upside, it might not matter that much to the Rockets, who already have a ton of high upside guys. If you can just get a high-end role player on a sub-MLE contract with years of club control, and that's what this pick should get, to me, the more I think about it, there's a strong case to just stay the course and take best player available unless a trade offer overwhelms you to where you've just got to act. Bryan, how would you balance all those factors and some of the competing interest at play when you think about Houston's situation in the macro?
Yeah, I think you covered a lot of things there, and I'm going to try to get to as many of them as I can recall.
Fair enough.
But I do think that the one thing that you did not get to that I'm going to just kind of mention first is that the value of the third pick in this class to other teams is probably not going to be as high as it is in typical draft classes. So
Fair.
I think the return on the investment that you're going to get with the 3 pick is not a typical return. You might not get the 3 pick in next year's class, for example. Teams probably aren't going to be giving you maybe a 25 pick at all, 2025 draft pick at all, because they want to be in on the Cooper Flag draft or whoever they might like in that class instead, right? So I think that ultimately the fact that you're probably not even going to get a pick in next year's class kind of leads me to think along the lines of what you're going to be saying as well, which is that retooling with rookie scale contracts is probably the smartest way to actually build this roster right now. I think if you look at teams that are having, success in this season right now that we're currently playing in, you're seeing guys that have had value beyond expectation on their rookie scale contracts. And Edwards at the 1 pick cap hit is obviously an exception because he's a 1 pick. But look at a team like Oklahoma City that has hit on multiple picks and has them on the rookie scale contracts, like Chet Holmgren, to a lesser extent Josh Giddey, Kassan Wallace, Jalen Williams. These are all guys who are making the rookie scale contracts and playing in the rotation because of it and having value. Now eventually they're going to have to pay all those guys, and it's not going to really work with their overall number. So they're going to have to probably consolidate. But thankfully for a team like Oklahoma City, they have enough picks to do that. I think this is Houston's chance to kind of do exactly that, which is find some replacement for some of the guys that they're going to have to pay at some point that they might not want to pay at some point. I think one of the reasons why, other teams maybe were bounced early, including like the Lakers, for example, is because they didn't have enough guys on rookie scale contracts contributing. They have guys like Jalen Hood-Schifino and Max Christie, and Maxwell Lewis, who were their recent picks. None of them really saw the court at all during the playoffs, and I think it hurt them. And I think that having as much depth for relatively cheap contracts as you can is a good way to replace guys who make a lot of money. And I think if guys like Donovan Mitchell are on the table, that obviously is something that you're going to have to consider if the price is right, especially because this is a natural fit for roster consolidation in Houston. You're going to have a lot of guys in Houston that do, I think a decent, that are going to require a decent amount of a payday when that time comes for their extensions and for their next contracts. But at the same time, if I have this pick, I'm looking for guys for the Rockets. I think finding a guy who could be a high-end role player, who could step on the court and make an impact the way some of the rookies did, like a Brandon Pajemski or a Jaime Jaquez did this season. And granted, with the 3 pick, you could probably even get a more talented guy than that. Potentially, primed to even trade down, turn that into 2 or 3 picks, right? That could be another thing I would consider. But at the same time, there's only so much roster space to trade down because you have to probably, pay those guys eventually too. So maybe not trade down and turn into multiple picks in this class, maybe just 1 pick for this class.
I do think it's interesting, the idea of trading down, but not for multiple picks in this draft, but perhaps, a lower pick in this draft and perhaps a future one. But besides that, now that we've established that the most likely course of action is either, a consolidation trade, so not a trade for a role player, but maybe a trade for a guy like Donovan Mitchell, or if not that, probably drafting the pick. You made a point that's been made a lot in this cycle, which is this is not as strong of a draft class as you typically have. The pick 3 doesn't have as much value as it typically has. I want to kind of put you on the spot a little bit and say, let's put some more concrete value or let's try to rank this draft class in 2 aspects, right? Both amongst the last 4 draft classes. I think the last one that people said that was weaker was the COVID class with Anthony Edwards, LaMelo Ball, and James Wiseman going top 3. Counting that year and the subsequent years, where would you rank this class, amongst those? And where would you rank, I think you have Reed Sheppard mock to the Rockets, where would you rank, in this case, Reed Sheppard amongst the core 6 prospects on the Rockets? So that would be Jalen Sengun, Cam Whitmore, Amen Thompson, Jabari Smith, and Tari Eason, just so we can kind of place just how weak of a draft class this is, both within the team and within the past few draft classes.
Yeah, I mean, okay, listen, I think to the first part of your question, I think that this is pretty objectively the NBA draft with the worst projected star power and the worst easily projectable top picks since 2013. I'd say that with pretty strong confidence, right? That's the drafted Anthony Bennett went number 1, Victor Oladipo went number 2, Otto Porter went number 3, Cody Zeller went number 4, Alex Len went number 5. None of the guys picked in the top 5 amounted to much, except for maybe Oladipo, who's had some success and a couple stops in Houston as well. Actually, is he still in Houston's roster right now, actually, now that I think about it, or no? I don't even care.
They used him.
I think we moved him for
Steven Adams.
The Steven Adams. Yeah, he was they converted KPJ's contract to Oladipo, and then Oladipo was the vehicle for Adams. So, yeah.
So,
funnily enough, Steven Adams was a 2013 draft pick.
So that's what I was...
Small world.
Yeah, that's actually what I was going to say is, now, none of the top 9 picks amounted to much, but CJ McCollum was picked at 10, Steven Adams was picked at 12, and then Giannis Antetokounmpo, who's undisputably a top 3 basketball player in the world, was picked at 15. Rudy Gobert, who is the only player standing left in the playoffs right now who is one of the top 15 highest paid players in the NBA, was picked at 27. And these kind of things happen, right? I think that just because it's hard to project who the stars in this class are, does not mean that it's going to be a weak class down the line. At the end of the day, there actually may have been as many stars in the 2013 class as any class, because you're getting guys like CJ McCollum, Steven Adams, who's played a long, strong career, Giannis and Gobert, who are 2 of the most impactful players, no matter how you judge it. All impact metrics will tell you that. Obviously, people have had their critiques of Gobert over the years, but, his impact is undeniable. That's not to scare away someone to say that there's no way the Rockets correctly identify who that guy is going to be at 3. I think we've gotten better at scouting over the years, and I think that these things, evolve, and I think that was a particularly strange draft class. 2020 was a particularly challenging draft class to evaluate because of the sample size and because we didn't get a March Madness tournament. And, I think that may have actually been the first year of the Ignite, potentially, if I'm remembering that correctly. There are plenty of factors that made that one hard to evaluate too. But all things considered, I think that no matter how you stack this class up, in terms of the projected star power at this point, I think it's the weakest since 2013. And at the same time, the 2013 draft ended up being actually pretty good. So ultimately, I would say that, the best player in this draft might not be picked at 1 or 2 or 3. Could be 3 if you're a Rockets fan, right? Like potentially they identify who that guy is. Or, to the point that Ben made earlier, potentially that 3 pick could be used to just draft a really high-end role player, right? CJ McCollum's not like a long-time all-star in this league, but if you get CJ McCollum in this draft, that's great, right? Like, if you get a Steven Adams in this class, that's great. I think that one of the players that's being talked about as the most likely Rockets pick, or one of the most likely Rockets pick, actually 2 of the players that are being talked about in that range are Donovan Clingan and Reed Sheppard. I don't think that either of them end up with multiple All-Star appearances in their career. I don't see that for them. I think both of them have long, strong NBA careers. And I would probably want both of them on my roster if I were a Rockets fan. And I think that, potentially both of them could make, win now impacts on rookie scale contracts. Donovan Clingan probably would not start for the Rockets, depending on what the situation looks like at center and Steven Adams' health and all of that. And maybe he does. I don't know. I think they'd figure that out later. But, that's a back-to-back national champion who has contributed to winning at a high level and has had one of the highest plus minuses in college basketball 2 years in a row. And all of the impact metrics always love Donovan Clingan. And, one player he gets compared to a lot is Rudy Gobert. But I think that realistically, do I expect Donovan Clingan to make like, the NBA Hall of Fame? Like, definitely not. I think that there are holes in his game. I think that if he was a projected, several time All-Star, he'd probably be the consensus one pick, and he's not. That being said, I actually wouldn't be terribly floored if he goes at 1. I think that's definitely something that whoever ends up picking at 1, presumably Atlanta, but maybe they trade it, considers. And Reed Sheppard, I kind of feel similarly about all of their opposite builds and opposite positions. Every metric tells you that Reed Sheppard's game should translate pretty well to the NBA. He had a great combine. He looked really good out there in the athletic testing, one of the best verticals of anyone who tested. And his numbers as a freshman were among the best we've ever seen from a guard or someone his height, just period. Like he was phenomenal in his 1 year at Kentucky. I think that he's somebody that I would definitely, highlight and want to have on my roster. Now, to the second part of your question, how would I rank them relative to Houston's current roster of young core players? Houston happens to have some pretty good young core players. So I would say that I personally would have Amen Thompson and Şengün definitively above them, no matter above everyone in this class. I think if there was a redraft with all of the players on the Rockets who were drafted in this rebuild, included in this class, I would say Amen Thompson definitively would be a consensus number 1 pick. I would say Şengün, of course, knowing what we know now, also would be. Ken Whitmore would probably go top 5 or top 10 in this class. He'd probably go where Ron Holland is projected. I think that they have relatively similar profiles and resumes. I'm not sure what to say about Jabari Smith Jr. compared to the guys who are in this class. But obviously, I think that he would probably go 1 in this class as well. So I think that he would probably be ahead of these guys too. So yeah, I think that it's a tough question because we don't know who the Rockets would end up picking. But I'd say pretty much everybody in that Rockets young core would probably be a player I'd rather have long term than the players in this class. But that's not necessarily a discredit. For example, like I brought up the Lakers earlier, I would take anyone in this class over anyone in the Lakers young core. The Rockets just happen to have a really deep young core. There's not a lot of teams that you could say this about. There's a lot of teams that I would not say this about. There's no one in the Phoenix young core that I would take above anyone in this class either. So, I think that Houston just happens to have they've drafted well. They've identified strong talent. They've gotten them all minutes, which is cool too. I think that a lot of times when teams draft players, those people end up not actually getting run. The Rockets are good about letting their guys play and show out. We saw that even when Tate was a rookie a few years ago, right? Like he was able to come in, and obviously he was older and had already had a professional career overseas, but they're willing to play their guys and see what we got. Tari Eason wasn't a lottery pick, but he came in and made an immediate impact. I think there are other teams that would have drafted Tari Eason that would have maybe just kind of kept him on the bench. So I think that the Rockets might not have that luxury in the future because they're so deep now that they might not be able to give these guys so much run. But if they drafted 3, whoever's getting picked at 3 is going to make the rotation, presumably. That's a costly player. That guy's probably gonna. Oh, and also, by the way, I didn't even mention Jalen Green when I was talking about guys. Obviously, I think I'd have Jalen Green above anyone in this class too. Anyway, that was my.
And it's always good to get the outside perspective. You mentioned the young core in Houston being so advanced relative to most others around the league. I'm assuming based on that you're on board with them giving the contract extension to Rafael Stone. When you look at the last 4 years, the body of work and how they've drafted, how they've developed, are you on board with them staying the course as far as this regime?
Yeah, definitely. I think that, the year-over-year improvement that they showed suggests that, they're trending in the right direction by all accounts. I think that Houston has a really bright and promising young future.
Yep.
Now the West is a gauntlet.
Right.
A promising young future could legitimately be the 8th seed.
Right.
And
And
that's
thus the pressure to potentially trade for a veteran. But yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's why they're a team that's primed for consolidation, because they have so much talent on their roster.
Yeah.
That's why a team like Cleveland makes a lot of sense too, because a team like Cleveland would be probably fairly interested in the young players and the rebuild and things like that, because they have a few young players on their roster with Evan Mobley, and Darius Garland's getting older, but he's still on the probably right side of
24.
25. Yeah, right side of 25. I know that when I make my 25 and under lists, he's made it the last few years, so I wasn't sure.
Still got one more.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that and picks would make sense for a team like Cleveland, and they could potentially get back into that rebuild over there, and reconstruct with that. But at the same time, Houston does not have that same luxury, I think, in the Western Conference. I think you need as much star power as you can. And thankfully, I think they've got multiple guys who have that sort of potential ceiling of being real stars in the NBA. And they're going to have to pay them all, and that's going to be too expensive to pay all of them. It just is. That's just not the nature of the NBA. I mean, we saw that with Oklahoma City many years ago with James Harden. You saw it to a smaller extent in Denver, losing Bruce Brown. You see it all the time. You see it with the Lakers who lost Caruso. It's a real thing. Like, eventually it gets to a point where the roster just doesn't work out financially. So, if you can get ahead of that and find replacements for guys in the draft, and have them on rookie scale contracts, that's the most valuable thing you could have. That's why Reed Sheppard makes a ton of sense to me as a potential Fred VanVleet replacement. I think that's a pretty natural comparison for him. That's a player that I would try to emulate the career of if I was a prospect. I think that they've really done a good job of maximizing what Fred VanVleet's build is and what he could play like in the NBA. And if Reed Sheppard can emulate a lot of those same traits and play similarly hard on defense and contribute in that sense, he's somebody who I would love to have on my roster as a potential replacement there.
In terms of your latest mock draft, which is available at For the Win, so you have Reed to the Rockets, which I think a lot of people do, because if they end up staying the course, then movement shooting is something that can fit in a number of roster constructs, even if the Rockets do make a bigger move elsewhere. And by the way, you mentioned the likelihood or lack thereof of keeping those guys into their second contracts, the core six. Rafael Stone was actually asked at his postseason press conference about whether the Rockets could do that, and he was insistent that they could. But at the same time, that's one of those, what do you expect him to say? He's not going to go on the record and say, no, we can't. Of course, he's going to put on a brave face saying that it's doable. As far as whether it actually is, especially in these high-end scenarios where all these guys look like potential star or at least rotation level players in the NBA, yeah, it's going to be hard. And so you do need to think financially, strategically, and that's where this pick comes into play. So you've got Reed currently mocked to the Rockets for the same reasons a lot of people do. The movement shooting, spacing the floor, it can fit in so many different roster constructs. It gives Rafael Stone a lot of optionality. Looking at the rest of your top 10, so I was going to ask you about, so your mock, which, as we talked about leading off the pod, you've never been afraid to go against the consensus a little bit. You're a little higher on Nikola Topic. You've got him at the Wizards at 2. Yeah. You're a little lower on Donovan Clingan. You have him at 9, which is actually a spot that the Rockets theoretically could trade down to. There's actually one of the Bleacher Report guys proposed a deal of Marcus Smart 9 for pick 3, in which case the Grizzlies would be picking Clingan. You've got Clingan actually falling to the Grizzlies. I was going to ask you if you were down on Clingan, but from listening to your comments a few minutes ago, I don't think you are. Is it more just about the fact that this class is so flat at the top and there's not a ton of variance between 2 and 9? Just explain sort of that gap and how you came to, I guess, your initial wave of picks.
Yeah, I think that there aren't necessarily a ton of teams picking in the lottery this year, or at least in the top 10, that are going to be looking to give a big man minutes. And by the way, I saw ESPN's Jeremy Woo made the same point today. Like, the mock that just came out with Gavoni and Jeremy Woo at ESPN was saying that, they've heard lots of good things about Clingan being in play at, as high as number 1 overall,
but they actually mocked Clingan in their latest mock at 6 because the Hornets are the first team that they saw potentially picking a center. So I guess that goes into it too. It's not just how you feel about the player, it's also who's going to actually pick them, right?
Yeah, and frankly, I don't think that the Hornets would want a center. I think I think that they would like to have Mark Williams in that role. I think that Mark Williams is a really serviceable center for them. And I think that honestly, like one of the teams that I think would be considering Clingan would be number 1 Atlanta. I think that Clingan should be in play at 1. I don't think he's the prototypical 1 pick by any stretch. That's not the profile that I think he has. But in this class, especially for a team like Atlanta that we don't know whether they're gonna rebuild or retool or whatever they wanted to define this next process as, I think that that's somebody to consider for sure. I'm not low on Clingan. I did have him low in my mock for sure.
But that's just because of the way the lottery went.
Yeah, definitely. I think it definitely, one of the reasons is probably because Detroit picking at 5 has 9 big men. San Antonio at 4 and 8 certainly has a big man as well. I think that Houston's a team that can and should consider Clingan at 3. I think the Wizards should pick a floor general at 2, and I think they will likely consider one. And I am high on Topic, and I think that Topic is somebody who definitely, listen, one of my favorite archetypes is like the Amen Thompson, floor general who's 6'7" type of a player. And that is, Topic does not have the 100th percentile athleticism that Thompson has. But I'm just a sucker for that kind of stuff. And I think the Wizards are going to, feel similarly when they're on the clock. But yeah, I mean, listen, my mock is not necessarily based on what I would do. I think that typically I'll try to incorporate as much intel as I can while also, going against the grain when I think it's necessary, which is why I think that, I was one of the few who have Clingan where I do. But if Clingan goes 1 or 2 or 3, I don't feel that there would be egg on my face, because these are all places that I seriously considered him at as well, before I had him where I had him. Also, that mock came out, I think, probably within 4 minutes of the lottery order being announced. So there wasn't a ton of thought that went into it, and it was pre-combine. I actually will say that I don't know how I feel about Clingan's combine. His measurements were really, really good, right? Really good. Like he's genuinely, I think, something close to 7'2" in socks. Like he is a huge dude. But from a mobility perspective and an athleticism perspective, he got beat by Zach Edey in every single drill, which is crazy because Zach Edey is not exactly someone known for his athleticism. And Clingan has struggled with injuries in the past too, and I just think that there's reasons you could talk yourself into Clingan and reasons you could talk yourself out of Clingan, which is why I have him where I have him. But I think that, if a team takes a swing on him at 1, 2, 3, 4, I would not be surprised whatsoever.
Definitely interesting. I definitely align with what you said about Clingan. I don't like him for the Rockets, namely because if he has to play with Şengün, I just don't trust the mobility of either of them to be able to guard anything other than a slow-footed 5. That being said, I think you should kind of give the people what they want, and then if anybody has any sort of a pulse on what Rockets Twitter's thinking, knows that if it's not Alex Sarr, people want Reed Sheppard. And so let's talk a bit about Reed Sheppard, who happens to be who you mocked to the Rockets, so that's perfect. The first thing I want to ask, so obviously the vert numbers came in 42 inches, everybody was going nuts, and he definitely has some hops, right? You can tell when you watch him play, there's some highlights that prove it. But at the same time, his standing reach, it was god-awful for any standard. Do you think he intentionally tanked his standing reach for his vert to look better? Because for those who don't, aren't too familiar, those two are related, right? The measurements are related.
Those measurements are related. I don't know. I don't know well enough to speak to it. So I will not speak to it because I think it's hard to say. Because those measurements are definitely related. I think it would be interesting to see, what number he actually hit in the air, right? Like with his max vert, because that's a good way to kind of combine the two. Is showing your standing reach plus max vert. I think that's a more interesting way of doing that. For example, a few years ago, I was just rereading some old draft coverage of mine, and I saw that Jalen Williams, who the Thunder ended up picking in that class, if you combine his overall standing reach plus his max vert, he actually was able to get higher in the air and touch higher, rather, at least, than guys like John Collins, Aaron Gordon, and strangely Rudy Gobert, despite Rudy Gobert's size. So I think that combining those two numbers is kind of the most interesting way to give you actual relative perspective on just kind of your overall total reach, right? Is how high you can jump relative also to your height too. And that way it kind of eliminates whether or not you may have been fudging the numbers on your total standing reach and height. And, I think that he had 5 dunks last season total, 6 dunk attempts. But, he had a lot of blocks for someone his size. Undersized guards do not typically have the block percentages that he had last season, especially undersized freshman guards. So I would say that, you saw it implemented in his defense. Also, 5 dunks sounds low, but there are guys way taller than him who didn't get 5 dunks last season as well. There are some people who just don't really have that as part of their game. So he can get up. And I think that, he's not an above the rim player. He's never going to be an above the rim player. That's not who he is or what he is or what defines him as a player. But, I think he has been someone who has been criticized for his athleticism in the past, right? Like that's seen as a weakness for him. And I think that it's clearly not a weakness for him. I think it's clearly
I think that's related to the haircut. I think a lot of people take off athleticism points because the haircut's not stylish enough. Just have to put it out there, man.
Yeah, no, that's certainly possible. I think that he's somebody who I think is somebody who I think just had a pretty interesting season for me in a lot of ways, and should pop in a lot of analytical models. And he finished really well at the rim too. So regardless of whether or not he was dunking or not, he was not getting punked at the rim. He shot I think it looks like 65% on what's considered to be close twos. That's really high. Like 65% at the rim for someone his size is really high and definitely worth mentioning. I think that's better than guys like Dalton Knecht who are way taller than him, and a bunch of other players who are similarly projected but have a lot more height than he does. So I'll take his rim finishing, and I'll definitely take note of it as well, because I think it's relevant. I think it matters. And, he's not going towards the rim and getting, his shots sent into the stands every time. He's somebody who's able to get in there and finish well. So, he also, I think, of the shots at the rim that he took, only 7.7% of them were assisted, which is really, really low. He was able to create his own shot at the rim, which is great. The fact that he's able to create his own shot at the rim at his size is also, definitely worth mentioning. So I'm high on Reed Sheppard. I think that, if I were the Rockets, that's who I would pick. That's who I think they're going to pick as well. I think we're aligned there. So that's one of those mocks that I think just kind of worked out really well, where I'm like, I have him about 3. I think the Rockets probably would have him around that range too. But also, these last few years, I think that we're seeing the Rockets have typically valued guys who are really, really good athletes, right? Amen Thompson is a 100th percentile athlete. Cam Thompson, probably the second best athlete in that class. I think that these last few years we've seen, and I know Rafael Stone has said he doesn't really have a player type, but I think that clearly there's something to be said about athleticism. Jalen Green, another pretty good athlete. Now Alperen Sengun, not so much, but at the same time, like, there's something to be said here.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a pattern that
and
you
with
can
Sengun, the
identify.
value at 16 was just too much to pass up.
Yeah.
At some point, it just becomes a value equation thing. Yeah, sorry for cutting you off, Paulo.
Yeah, but I also think that with Sengun, he has a lot of other things that balance out.
True.
And I think, maybe Jalen's not the best example of this. Maybe Jabari also isn't, but those were different picks at the top of the draft. I think Tari Eason, Amen Thompson, Alperen Sengun, they do have a type when it comes to athleticism. Obviously, Jalen is uber athletic and much more the same thing. But they also have a type where they like high IQ players. And I think high basketball IQ players. I think Sengun fits into that. And Thompson fits into that. Defensively, Tariq also fits into that. Even though offensively, he has some ways to go there. And I think Sheppard also fits into that mold. And you made a very interesting comparison. And I was the first few times that I was watching him, I saw a lot of him taking a lot of the same shots that Curry takes, but he's obviously not even close to Curry even as a prospect.
He shoots deep though. He shoots really deep. Like I have data.
Yeah.
I have data that suggests that among the draft prospects, he shoots like he has the most deep shots of anybody.
Which is why I was looking for, because if you compare back when the Paulo Banchero draft, I didn't comp him to LeBron James, but I said I saw a lot of similar things as a power wing rather than I saw him as a power wing ideally rather than a bully ball 4, which turned in the comps from Julius Randle to a guy like LeBron James. And obviously the comp's not LeBron. I meant the type of player. And you mentioned something similar. You mentioned Fred VanVleet, which I think makes a lot of sense. But as you said as well, he seems to be a lot better at finishing at the rim than Fred VanVleet has ever been. He seems to take a lot of the same shots, and he seems to be really good at punishing or at playing or at punishing people going under screens and being quick to identify that has happened and taking the shot, both from 3-point range, from the mid-range as well. So I think offensively that all makes a lot of sense. I think defensively, a lot of people differentiate Reed Sheppard from Rob Dillingham because they say Reed Sheppard's a much better defender, and I would agree with that. That being said, what I want to ask about is we see that he has the first, or he has athleticism, going up and down, and he has some agility. I think, this doesn't really mean too much, but his lane agility numbers were fine. His sprint numbers were good. What I was going to ask is, watching the film, lateral mobility did not strike me as a strength. And I know a lot of people point to the 2.5 steals, which means he can play passing lanes. He's a good off-ball defender. My question becomes, okay, he's a good offensive player, Fred VanVleet type of archetype. He's good off the ball defensively. What do you make of his on-ball defense? Because as a 6'3" point guard with a 6'3" wingspan, it's not going to get any easier for him. And at the same time, as a point guard, he's going to be guarding point of attack by default a number of possessions. What do you make of his on-ball defense?
I think that one thing that comes up a lot with Reed Sheppard when you talk to scouts is that they think that he wants to be a good defender. And I think that is actually one of the most important traits to know about a prospect. I think that a lot of players come into the NBA and don't necessarily want to be a good defender. But I think when you watch Reed Sheppard, you can tell that he clearly does want to be good. I think that there's some elements of his game and some elements of his build that don't necessarily allow him to be a good defender. But at the same time, I think that defense matters to this guy, and I think that he's somebody who can make a defensive impact. And I think that the defensive numbers were pretty good for someone his height. So I would definitely not be terribly concerned about Reed Sheppard. And I think that if it came down to it, defense was the biggest liability. There are players in this class I'd be more concerned about on the defensive end than Reed.
All right, so to transition beyond Reed, I want to ask you about other options at 3 and guys you think that are either good or bad fits. And quite frankly, with Reed, I think we can all agree that he's potentially a very good fit here. That doesn't mean that he's going to be the pick. It doesn't mean that he has to be the pick, but just in terms of does he fit for this roster construct, what the Rockets are trying to build, their philosophies, I think all three of us would say yes. Beyond Reed, I want to get at least one guy that you think would fit and one guy that you think wouldn't. And I'll actually start, and this is one where Paulo and I disagree. I actually do think Clingan is potentially a fit in Houston, not necessarily because of how he and Şengün can or can't play together. Of course, I'd love for the three-point shot to develop the way some scouts think that it will and give you that option down the line. But even if it doesn't, there's so much value in today's NBA where teams are getting bigger and bigger. You've got Gobert, you've got Nikola Jokic. It seems like you're seeing more of these behemoths, especially in the Western Conference, by the year, that I think just being able to play a different way, even if the presence of Şengün initially sort of caps him at, 20 minutes per game, other than a few matchups where you might can play dual big, probably not in the playoffs. I think there's just value in having that optionality. Should also mention the Rockets have yet to extend Alperen Şengün, so it's not 100% lock that he's going to be here for the next 5-10 years. I don't think you can say that of any player amongst their young core, as promising as it looks. I don't think anyone on the Rockets as currently constructed has proven enough to where you would say 100% this player is going to be there for the upcoming generation of Houston Rockets basketball. You're not at that point yet where you have to treat anyone as 100%. So that's in the back of your mind. But more than that, I think just the optionality to play two different ways and to have that bigger body to handle some of those difficult matchups, there's value in that. And then the other aspect of it for me, I think Donovan Clingan is a guy who's extremely projectable. So even if the best case scenario for Şengün plays out in that he signs his next contract with the Rockets, he continues to play like an all-star, perhaps he gets even better next year to where you feel like a year from now, okay, Alperen Şengün is for sure going to be our guy in the middle, a 30-plus minutes per game player for as long as his prime lasts. Even in that best case scenario where everything works out financially and on the basketball floor for Alperen Şengün, and let's say that Clingan either doesn't develop the three-point shot or to Paulo's concern earlier, maybe the foot speed just isn't there to defend anyone on the perimeter. Even if all those things play out, then I think Clingan is a guy who is very projectable. And so because of that, he would always have good trade value down the line. In that even if he's only playing 20 minutes per game in Houston, then I think it's potentially 20 valuable minutes for you. I don't think you really consider Steven Adams now in his 30s on a one-year deal. I don't think he should really factor into this equation when we're talking about an asset like number 3 overall pick in the draft. And so even if Clingan does end up capped in terms of minutes, I think you could trade him down the line, and teams, because he's very projectable, I think he's one of the safer players in the draft, then I think you could get pretty good trade value for him down the line. So even if the role isn't crystal clear for Donovan Clingan in Houston, I do actually like him as a fit just because the optionality, and I think the worst case scenario in terms of there not being, a starters level role for him long-term in Houston, then I think that scenario would work out as well, as long as Clingan develops as a player the way I think at least Bryan and I think that he can. So I think that's someone beyond Sheppard that could be a fit. One guy that I don't really see as a fit, and it's surprising to me that at least a few mocks I've seen putting him in Houston, is Rob Dillingham. I just think that at 164 pounds, I question the defense. Now, I know it's not that Reed is that much bigger than him, but he's a little bit bigger. He's certainly thicker. And also, Reed is a movement shooter. He's a guy who can flourish off ball. As opposed to Dillingham, you have the limited size, the weight concerns. He's not an impact defender. And then offensively, I get the skill set. And, if you squint hard enough, you can see some Kyrie in him. But on a Houston team that already has so many ball dominant guys, it's tough for me to see Dillingham getting enough touches to unlock the best aspects of his game. So because of that, it's not that I'm down on Rob Dillingham, the prospect. I just don't really see the fit for Dillingham in Houston. So beyond Reed, who I think we all agree is a positive fit in Houston, if that materializes, Clingan is another guy that I view as a good fit. Dillingham is an example of someone that I view as a not so good fit. Bryan, when you're looking at other guys potentially in play for 3, what do you think as far as guys that are good or bad fits for the Rockets?
Sure, yeah. I'll echo what you say about Clingan in that if you look at this Minnesota team that is, in the Western Conference Finals
as well, and as Reed, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that there's so many great big men in the Western Conference that Houston's gonna have to match up against that any weapon you can have to go up against that is a good thing. So you outlined a lot of the reasons about the pairing with Şengün, but I think that ultimately anything you can do to try to throw a weapon at Jokic, try to throw a weapon at Anthony Davis, try to throw a weapon at the gauntlet of big men that you're going to have to face in the West for the foreseeable future, you can and should do. So Clingan is an example of someone who I think would fit, but I'll think to add another name that we have not mentioned yet. Two names. I'll throw out two names. One that does fit, one that doesn't. I would throw Castle, Stephon Castle, as a name that I think could fit. If you talk about guys who don't necessarily need the ball in their hands, that's one right there. I think that he could potentially project as a Herb Jones type in the NBA, and that's not necessarily even the highest projection for him. I think that Herb Jones obviously just made second team all defense. The analytics that I have that are kind of hard to come by, but I'm lucky enough to have, say that Castle gives up the fewest points per possession of any single player in this draft class. He, I think, is probably the most elite defensive player, at least perimeter defensive player that we have that's not in Clingan. Now, obviously, them playing together kind of enhances both of their defensive impact metrics. But, I think that we saw Castle's role as a freshman. Herb Jones, I think, played 4 years in college before he was ready to contribute at an NBA level. We just saw Castle play 1 year, and, who knows where he'll be by the time Herb Jones was turning pro 4 years later. I think that he's somebody who I'm probably higher on than some. I would definitely consider him as high as 2. I think that, at the end of the day, like if he has a Justice Winslow type of career, which is not a good thing, I wouldn't necessarily be surprised either. But he's somebody who I would be comfortable taking a swing on, especially for a team like Houston, because defense matters. And I think that, ultimately defense is something that every team could use, and Castle has that. I think he clearly contributes to winning and did last season. His first season in college basketball, he won a championship. Like that's great stuff. And you need that always, team players who can contribute that way. And I think, he views himself as a potential point guard, right? Even if he doesn't play point guard in the NBA, I think he's got some of those playmaking skills. And I think anytime you can add, somebody who could potentially project as an elite defensive player, you should. And it's not like Houston is incredibly rich on the defensive end of the floor right now. Like I think that they've got, some holes, over there. I think that they finished probably in the bottom third in the league in defense last season, if I remember correctly. So, I think that.
Well, I think they were top 10 overall, but they had stretches where it was ugly, and there was regression towards the back half of the year.
Okay. Sorry about that.
Yeah, they actually did end up in the top 10 for the season as a whole, but yeah, it was very hit or miss. They came out of the gates incredibly strong, and then for about the final 2/3 of the season, March excluded, it was a lot rougher.
Gotcha. I was looking at cleaning the glass, and I couldn't quite find where they were at with points per possession allowed on defense. But either way.
And there were also some metrics that indicated they were a little bit lucky. So even though I think they finished like 7th or 8th in defensive rating, I want to say if you account for shot luck, it's probably a few notches below that. So solid, but not great by any means, to your point.
Yeah, definitely. And, anytime you could add a player who's a potentially elite defensive player, like there's reason to do that. It is kind of the ultimate point here. So that being said, that's somebody who I'd consider a potential fit. And then somebody who I'd be probably more hesitant about that I think potentially has kind of gotten some projections already and was mentioned in Kelly Ego's article would be Matas Buzelis. I know that people have questioned his motor in the past. I know that he's somebody who, has been in play as the 1 pick at some points this year before the season started more so, and then had some good stretches a little bit when Ron Holland went out. Ultimately, I think that he's somebody who is just probably a little bit too much of a project. I think that the ceiling's pretty high for Matas Buzelis. But I think that, there are just some questions for me that that I'm not necessarily sure I have the answer to. So I wouldn't be in a rush to add him to my roster if I'm Houston. And I know that he's somebody who I think has been linked to them a little bit, and he's kind of been mocked in that range. And I heard I think Kelly Ego reported that he interviewed well with the Rockets, and that's all fine and good, but it's just not somebody that I would probably be rushing to put over there.
A couple of guys that you didn't mention, and I'll frame the question from a hopeful standpoint because I do think Alex Sarr should be, pretty clearly the number one pick. But you've shown an openness, I think, larger than what I had to the possibility that, if Washington takes a fourth general point guard, which I could see them doing, and Atlanta either trades back or doesn't have the patience to go for a guy like Sarr, who's probably a project, even though he can probably help year one, not necessarily the same timeline as what they have going on, at least willing enough to trade it. Do you see any scenario where the Rockets could end up with Sarr? Because to me, he fits two things that the Rockets really need moving forward, which is a way to deal with the Wemby and Chet types, even though Sarr is obviously way behind those two, but eventually you'd hope that he could develop into the same type of guy that you could, match up with them. And secondly, basically built in a lab to play with Auburn Shingle, because the mobility concerns aren't there as much as most other rim protecting prospects in drafts, as as far back as you want to go in past drafts. Do you think there's any chance he falls to 3, or that the team that's picking at 1 is willing to have trade back to 3?
Yes, I would say yes to both questions. I think that this class is far from solidified with the draft order. I think that there's a real possibility that anyone that's being projected in the top 3 could go lower than the top 3. Someone like Clingan comes up, that means someone has to go down. Let's say a team, falls in love with any of these guys during the pre-draft process, that means someone else has fallen down a little bit. So I think that Castle could jump into the top 3 as well. I think that, someone maybe feels that Zachary Rizichet is too inconsistent. Maybe he falls a little bit. Maybe a team really does believe, the hype with Montas Pazelas. He jumps up. Yes, I think that any number of scenarios are still very much in play. I don't think that there's a perfect marriage for any of these teams in the top 3. Obviously the classic example we can give is, something like Wemby, right, where it's like it was obvious, but, it's not. I think in previous seasons, there have been fairly obvious picks at 2 and 3 too, where it's like, okay, Wemby is the obvious pick at 1, but, this team would obviously love this player at 3 as well. I don't think that any of these players are a perfect fit for any of the teams drafting in the top 5. I think that I think that there's a lot of players who are going to have consideration across the board here. I really do. I think that there are some guys who could potentially jump up to the top 5 that are not being mocked there at all, like Salon in France. He's somebody who I think is going to get a lot of hype over these next few weeks, especially as maybe the potential mystery man in this class. He's played really, really well recently during the play. Yeah, what's that?
I said it's already started. I've seen some of that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that he's already getting some hype, and I think that he's playing well in France, and he's making an impact on the playoffs over there. Maybe there's a team who thinks that Cody Williams, could be like his brother, right? And I think that there's a real chance that Cody Williams could be in that range. I know that there are teams that definitely like him as well. I think there are teams that don't like him too. But it only takes one team to really like you. And I think that there's a lot of guys in this range that could go up, and I don't think that Sarr's resume or Rizichet's resume or Topic's resume or any of these guys that we're talking about is strong enough to be a surefire top 3 pick in this class or in any class. And that's not a knock on any of them. I think it's just the nature of who they are right now, is that they're not clear-cut top 3 picks. They're not. And that doesn't mean that they won't have clear-cut top 3 careers of this class. I think when it's all said and done, maybe they do. But ultimately, I think that even Alex Sarr, who is considered to be the consensus one pick, he did not light the world on fire in Australia's NBL, which is, not as great of a league as the NBA. I don't think Sarr is going to come in and be the rookie of the year favorite even necessarily, even if he goes one. So it'll all come down to fit, how teams want to use these guys, stuff like that. But if a team doesn't fall in love with Sarr at one, I wouldn't be shocked. I think if they view, Clingan or someone else as a better fit for their roster, I wouldn't be surprised at all.
Okay, first of all, I had and maybe this is me being ignorant. I had no idea that Cody Williams was Kalen Williams' brother.
Yeah.
How did you not?
I don't. They do.
That's a part of
alike,
the appeal.
But just
it's so easy to throw out the Jalen Williams comp because it's literally his brother. Yeah.
Sure.
He was a McDonald's All-American, whereas Jalen was not. Cody was actually the more highly touted of the two.
Interesting.
So he's a better Jalen Williams, is what you're telling us.
Oh no, I'm not saying that.
I think you should say that louder so the Wizards hear it and the Hawks hear it.
There you go.
I think he's from Atlanta potentially, so it's something to consider. And I think, Cody Williams was a McDonald's All-American, and he also played for Team USA's U19 roster as well. So he had a bigger pedigree.
Just so I'm going to ask this of everybody that we invite that is draft centered, just because I don't understand. I don't understand why Khalil Ware is mocked as low as he is. Even if there are attitude concerns, motor concerns, I just don't see how the upside isn't tantalizing enough for one, especially in a draft that seems to be weak-ish upside in upside swings. How is he not being mocked in the top 10? I don't get it.
Well, Paulo, you're talking to a guy right now who went to Oregon, where he transferred away from. So maybe that's the answer, right? Maybe it's leaving the Ducks.
I mean, that's fair enough, but if so, the Rockets.
That's not the reason at all. I just have a personal connection there because I'm an Oregon fan and an Oregon alum. So anyone who leaves Oregon, I'm like, how could you leave Eugene? It's so beautiful.
Listen, if the Rockets are obviously not at this stage of the rebuild anymore, but some team starting off their rebuild is going to trade back and pick him. And I think that they're not going to regret it. That's all I'm going to say. Because, I mean, I like the footwork. I like the touch. I like the shooting form. I like the size. I just, I see that he is a bit lazy. But still, man, guys that are lazy have been picked much higher on much better drafts. And I don't know. I had to touch on it. I'm going to, Ben, just a heads up. I'm going to do this in every single pot. So you guys better get used to it.
I can tell. All right, so last question for me, because I know we've been going on for over an hour now, so we'll try and wind this thing down. So there's been a few reports the last couple of weeks of the Rockets potentially being interested, and this is going beyond the 2024 draft, in trading some of their assets from Brooklyn back to the Nets for picks from Phoenix that they acquired in the Kevin Durant trade that go a little bit further out. The picks that Houston owns from Brooklyn go through 2027. I believe the picks from Phoenix go through either 2029 or 2030. And I believe it's the same unprotected first-round picks or swaps alternating years. So people have been confused why the Rockets would do this, especially with Brooklyn's outlook being very bad, at least for the time being bad. Now, I know being in New York, all it takes is one star to come available at the right moment, and perhaps Brooklyn can make the climb a lot quicker than we're anticipating. But right now, they're a 32-50 team without a star. So there's a lot of hype here in Houston for what the picks the next couple of years would be. And one myth that I want to dispel, the Rockets are not down on the next two draft classes. I've heard that they're bullish on both of them, certainly being better than 2024. I've heard they like 2025, and they really, really like 2026. So I'm curious your thought on that, just as far as how the next few draft classes are stacking up. I know things can change, but right now I'm told the Rockets like both of them, especially 2026. So it's not so much that they're down on that. It's just, look, those picks should be disproportionately valuable to the Nets because of the optionality. If the Nets get their own picks back, then they have full control over or at least some control over the expected value of them, i.e. the final number of that pick, because it's dictated by whether they win or lose games and how they put their roster together. So anytime that you have a situation where one of your assets should be disproportionately valued by one team, then sure, you should explore if there's a deal there where you get more value by dealing with that team. And that's what this is. That goes back to some of the Mikal Bridges discussions. And I think it's the same concept here. The other factor for the Rockets, if you don't have the ability to play one of these rookies, and it's difficult for the Rockets for the reasons we've been describing throughout this podcast with how full their rotation already is, especially with young players, then the liquidity of that asset will take a hit. If you have a young player who's not playing, who's not developing, I know they can put him in the G League temporarily, but that's not a long-term solution by any means. And so from Houston's perspective, and they look at these as assets for down the line, they think they're going to be contending 2 or 3 years from now. So it's about potentially using this, if not filling internally, then externally using these picks or the players that result from those picks as assets in a trade. Then if you pick a young player and you don't have a clear path for him to play a lot of minutes initially, then the value of that could easily decline. So from the Rockets standpoint, it's not so much that they're down on the next 2 draft classes, not at all. It's more, look, if you can extend that window out into the late 2020s, even 2030, then there's just more liquidity to that asset in terms of its value on the open market. I think that's the way the Rockets are looking at this, in that as soon as you draft a player, in many ways, it's like, and I've made this analogy plenty of times, longtime listeners will know exactly where I'm going, but it's like driving a new car off the lot. A lot of that value is going to instantly go away when the pick is not abstract, when the pick does not represent flexibility, when the pick is an actual player with strengths, but also with weaknesses. And now if the player shows those strengths, if the player develops, then sure, you can recoup that value and then some down the line. But if he doesn't, then there's a lot of downside. There's not a lot of upside. So I think for the Rockets, the calculus here is that, and I don't think they would just do a straight swap of the Brooklyn picks for the Phoenix picks, because I do think that the Brooklyn picks have a little more value when you look at their outlook the next couple of years. But conceptually, at least to just see if something's there, I can understand why they're doing it. It's not they're down on the next 2 draft classes. They like them. It's just if you can extend that window out a little bit longer and perhaps get a little bit of a premium because those picks should be even more valuable to the Nets, then it's worth at least making the phone call, at least exploring. So as I understand it, that's sort of the behind the scenes thinking here. Bryan, does that make sense to you? And then beyond that, what do you think as far as the next few draft classes? Are there any that stand out as particularly strong or particularly weak?
Yeah, no, both of the next 2 draft classes are particularly strong at the top. I think that it's hard to identify anything about the depth of the class until we see who's actually in it, who materializes, etc. I think that realistically, we don't know that until we see who actually ends up declaring for each class. But, both of the next 2 classes have a lot of big names to the top. I think they're pretty deep. We'll see though, because I think the guys in this class who were projected really high heading into this year, did not end up materializing, right? I think a lot of the guys that were, considered the best players were guys like Isaiah Collier and DJ Wagner and, just got Justin Edwards. And, it's not uncommon at all for a player to be projected, top 5 before the season and end up having to go back to school. That's not uncommon at all. We see that every year. We've seen that with guys the Rockets have drafted. Cam Whitmore was somebody who was projected really, really high and had to, slide to 20. These things happen. So I'm not huge on projecting the depth, but in terms of the top heaviness, both these classes have guys toward the top that I'd be excited to have on my roster. Talking specifically about the Brooklyn and the Phoenix picks, I would say that I would definitely be shorting the Suns if I were any
also a
team
good
in the
point.
league. Yeah, I think that one of the assets I'd most like to have would be future Suns picks. That'd be fun. So if I am Phoenix or if I am Houston and I can, do what I can to get my hands on any picks from Phoenix in the future, Even if they don't use the picks themselves, like you said, you can potentially they'll trade that pick to something that's better in the future. That could be easily a top 5 pick or at least a lottery pick moving forward. Top 5 or a lottery pick or whatever it might be in a stronger draft class will probably have more trade value down the road. If I could get my hands on that, I definitely would.
And I guess it's a situation where even if they have, 2 superstars under contract now, look, KD is 36 years old. Who knows what happens there? And then whether KD ages out or eventually leaves by some other means, then at that point, all that's between the Suns and being really bad is one Devin Booker trade request, right? And at some point, the precedent is there that he probably will if the Suns are a bad team heading into his 30s.
Yeah, I mean, there's already whispers of New York, and I think that New York might not be a team that would want him for several reasons. But, if we're hearing the New York stuff now, that could grow into New York and Miami, New York and Miami and Boston, New York and, just whatever the classic examples of trade destinations, the Lakers, whoever this, that, whatever. These things will come up, and I could see that happening. And, KD's getting older, and, we've seen what just a Bradley Beal team looks like with the Wizards, and it's not great. And that was when Bradley Beal was at his most effective. So, I think across the board, the Suns are a team I'm pretty low on moving forward. So, the Suns also, though, without one note on that, though, is if the Suns don't have control of their picks, then
they're incentivized to be very aggressive.
Exactly. They're not going to be bottoming out. They might naturally, just due to poor management, bottom out, but they're not going to.
They won't tank.
Yeah, they won't tank. Obviously, the Nets weren't tanking when the Celtics picks when the Celtics own their picks, and it still worked out for the Celtics.
And the Nets weren't tanking this year.
Exactly, when it worked out for the Rockets too. Ultimately, I think that the Suns pick would be a pick that I would want if I was Houston. I would definitely be targeting that if I could.
Fair point. One related question, and then I promise we'll close out. So the Suns are a team that I've been eyeing as far as the very short term as a team the Rockets could conceivably pass in the standings, because as good as we feel about the Rockets, 41-41, you've got this young core. Because the Rockets are so young, they should have more upward mobility in terms of year-to-year improvement than many other teams in the West, simply because you can expect players on the Rockets to grow more between this season and next relative to teams that are more veteran-laden. In fact, some of the veteran-laden teams might actually decline between this year and next based on the usual Asian curves. Yet, as we've said a few times in the pod, the Western Conference is insanely hard. So you look at the Rockets, you say, okay, they're 41-41, and in a perfect world, they take the Oklahoma City jump. That's probably far-fetched in a Western Conference where it's just so top-heavy and there's so much depth. But I do look at a few of the older teams. Obviously, the Suns are one, the Warriors are another, maybe the Lakers, although LeBron has defied Father Time, and the Lakers actually are set up pretty well to potentially add a star in the trade market. They finally do have some first-round draft capital. So in terms of the Rockets going from, a 500 team where they are this year to, let's say, 45 to 50 wins next year, I think that would be the ideal scenario for them in their upward trajectory. So some of that can sort of just happen internally in terms of their players just getting better. But you're also going to need to see, ideally, some regression from other teams in the West. Besides the fact that 10 teams are ahead of them already, you also have to consider that, the Spurs should be better with Wemby. The Grizzlies should be back to at least somewhat normal with a healthy John Morant for the full season. Really, only Utah and Portland are teams that are, clearly at the bottom tier of the West. Everyone else at least has some reason to have a little bit of optimism. Even Utah, if they keep marking, and they were good until they went into full tank mode the last couple of years. So in terms of the Rockets getting better, I mean, they should be a better team just simply based on the fact that young teams improve. But in terms of actually climbing up the West standings to get in, ideally the play-in range or even the playoffs, what are some teams ahead of them in the standings now that conceivably, if things break right this summer and in terms of, player development over the upcoming months, do you see any teams that they could potentially, like the Suns, perhaps jump?
I'm not sure how I feel about the Clippers long term, especially with Paul George potentially leaving. Who knows what the Warriors end up looking like down the road? Obviously that big three could be done already. I think those are probably the teams that I would target. beyond the ones that you've mentioned.
Yeah, and of course that's as the Rockets are currently constructed. If they do something like the aforementioned Donovan Mitchell trade, then all of a sudden the calculus changes a little bit. But as of now, we're going on the roster the Rockets have as of this May 23rd recording.
But hey, don't count out the Spurs as a team to make the leap pretty soon.
Yeah,
because that Wemby jump is coming in the stand-in soon.
Yeah, and Wemby's going to be a draw to other trade targets around the league, I assume.
Yeah, definitely.
Players will want to play with Wemby. Yeah, I've heard that. I believe that. That's real. All right. Well, great episode, great insight, Bryan. Thank you so much for the time. Your Twitter/X handle is just at Bryan Kalbrosky, correct?
Yeah.
And your mocks are at For the Win. Any timeline for when your next mock is coming out?
I'll probably have one after the early entry withdrawal deadline, which should be next week.
Next week. Perfect. We'll be looking for it. All right, folks. He is Bryan Kalbrosky. As mentioned, you can follow him on Twitter at Bryan Kalbrosky. As for myself and Paulo, you can follow me at Ben DuBose and Paulo at Paulo Alves NBA. And with that, we've had a pretty thorough show, so I think we will wrap it right here. For Bryan and Paulo, I'm Ben, and if you want more from the show, beyond following us on Twitter, if you want more content from the Logger Line as soon as it comes out, the best way to get that is to subscribe to us, Apple, Google, Spotify. Subscribe, leave a 5-star review. You get the benefit of episodes right when they come out, and we get the benefit with your subscription and hopefully your happy review of looking good to the sponsors and partners that help us produce this show, most notably Sports Talk 790, flagship radio station of the Rockets, Karbach Brewing, where they develop their beer, Clutch City Lager, in collaboration with the Rockets, and USA Today's Rockets Wire, where I'm editor. If you want to consume the content from the likes of Rockets Wire, Sports Talk 790, or Karbach Brewing, just hit up the link tree at the Logger Line on Twitter. That's the one-stop shop where you can find, obviously, our distributors, Apple, Google, Spotify, but also the links to those aforementioned partners. All right, that'll do it for today. As always, we appreciate you so much for listening, and please come back soon for another new episode of The Logger Line.